All right, everyone. So this is part two of the Rhino introduction. And honestly, as you can kind of see here, I'm starting with the file that we left off with last time. And the only changes I made is I just kind of added a couple more layers, right? So I'm separating out the lines from the planes to the volumes to the linears, right? Just so I have a better kind of granularity over the different kinds of elements that are in my scene, okay? And this is actually just going to be a kind of extension or refinement of some of the commands that we showed you earlier, how to work with things once you kind of have things already set up. So first on the list are kind of two commands that are part of the same family, they're cousins. One is called MoveEdge, and the other one is called MoveFace, okay? So MoveEdge, so let's see, I just type it in move, right? MoveEdge over here, and select edges. So you can select, for example, let's say here, if I wanted to kind of extend one of these edges of this plane, right? So I can select that edge and then enter, and then you'll click on, right, the point to move from, and then you can click on a point to move to, right? And some of these you will have to be a little bit careful with, right? Because let's say in this case, right, because it had two other surfaces kind of connected to it, it will pull those with it, right? So in the case, and that's because this particular right surface was a poly surface, meaning that it was kind of joined together, right? Now, we'll go over some of these other differences here in a little bit, but let's say I'm just going to copy this out, right? Just so you guys can see a little bit better. So let's move edge again. So move edge. If I pick, let's say, this face or this edge, right, which doesn't have any adjacent surfaces with it, and I do the same thing, then you'll see that I can, right, and you'll see it still snaps to things. In certain cases, you'll see that it might go up or down, right? If I'm going from the side, then actually it goes into completely free movement. Typically, you're not going to want that, right? Typically, you want to, and I'm using the sort of, tracking to try to get it to generally move in a perpendicular direction like this, right? So it's just extending it or shortening it, right? Now that being said, if I repeat the command, enter, you'll see there's an option to give it a direction constraint, right? So if you toggle that, then it will ask you, right, for going from none to, let's say, vertical, right? And the vertical actually makes it so that it will only move vertically, right? Or, and again, direction constraint, instead of vertical, I'd say, first face normal, or second face normal. And you'll find out, so that first face normal, in this case, is basically the same as vertical, okay? So just know that there are some kind of options there, all right? Move edge can be paired with multiple edges. So let's say, in this case, I select all of those edges together, right, by using a boundary crossing selection. Then what that means is that if I move it to a place, well, let me disable the direction constraint. Then I can actually, let's say, move it in a direction that slides everything else with it, right? So just be aware that you can do single edges, you can do 2 edges, 3 edges, or multiple edges at once, right? But you just have to have like a reference set up so you know that you're kind of moving it in the right direction, okay? MoveFace does pretty much a very similar thing, although I'm going to copy out a volume because this is probably easier to see or understand that way. So again, move, right? Move face here. So instead of pick an edge, you just pick a surface or a face of a poly surface like that, right? A volume like this. Enter. And this should also just by default, right, be going in the perpendicular direction, right, of the surface. Although in this one, right, the direction constraint options are none or normal, right? And normal means it's normal to the surface that you pick. So it's like extending it, right, or retracting it, right? So that's the difference. Now, where MoveFace can be pretty useful is in terms of like, oh, let's say if I'm looking at these linears, right, and I want to shorten one of them, right, instead of trimming them off and trying to fix them and cap them, right, MoveFace and I'll just pick right the end of this linear, click there, and I know that, okay, well, because the direction constraint is set to normal, I can just extend it or shorten it. And when I'm shortening it, I can actually try to snap to other geometry, right, as a reference. So let's say, I'm just going to shorten it so it aligns with this thing, right? And then, I know that it's going to align, right? So that's another kind of quick way of basically modifying existing geometry. So that's probably the tool that's closest. And so like this would work on a poly surface like this, like that, right? I can pick a face, right? And just kind of, right? Oops, we overdid that. Pick a face and, let's say midpoint, right? And easily modify these, right? That way, okay? So that's the tool that's probably, if those of you who used SketchUp before, it's the closest tool to the push and pull tool in SketchUp. Okay, so that's those two. And then as kind of part of that, I'll show you, for example, let's see, this, and this. So these guys, when I select this, right, because this was made using a box, right? And if you remember last class, this was made basically by an extrusion, right, from a polyline that is a poly surface, okay? So I need to give you kind of two concepts, right? Normally, when we just type line, right, and enter, right, and we draw a line, this is a sort of single line, right? The command automatically terminates after the second click. Now, usually, actually, for the most part, I will be drawing with a polyline. So polyline, right? And for many people, the shortcut would be PL, right, for a polyline. This is a line that continues, meaning that after your second click, third click, it just keeps on going until, right, you right click to terminate it, right? Now the difference here, right, is let's say if I did a normal line, I can do the same thing, right? I can do this. Oops. I can do normal line. I can do that, right? And then start it again, right? And then start it again, and then start again, right? These are all kind of the same thing, except, right, after I'm done, the polyline one is all together. The normal line one is single line are all kind of separate objects, right? They're selected separately, they're edited separately, okay? Now, there's not much difference because there is a command, and these are also kind of opposites, right? Explode and join. The icon for explode is over here, right? It looks like a little explosion, corner of a little explosion. But let's say this polyline, right? If I click on the explode command, what it does is actually explodes it down to its constituent parts, just like the one below it. At the same time, right? If I type join, right, it will ask me select objects will join, so I can pick through. 1, 2, 3, enter. That just joins it back into one. So the one I drew separately, I can join that too. I can select everything together and just type join, right? It does the same thing, okay? Now, do note this only works if, right, for lines, if the points are actually touching. So let's say if I try to join this, first, second, I'll get an error, right? It says, oh, your endpoints for your lines aren't actually touching, right? So you'll get this sort of weird error, right? So it only works for things that are actually meeting, right? So the same thing actually exists for poly surfaces. So this is a single surface, right? This is a poly surface. A poly surface, I can explode it and actually break it down into its constituent parts. Same thing for a box. The box, I can explode it, and I can break it down into constituent parts. So for example, right, you have a box and you're just kind of wanting to open up one side or the other, right? So after, let's say you explode it, I can say, oh, I'm just going to delete one side. I'm deleting that one. I'm going to delete this one, right? And so it's more of a tunnel of sorts. Select everything back and then join it. Okay, so now it's one thing again, except with those two deleted sides, right? So this is a way to kind of manage things essentially. Just kind of be aware that generally, for poly surfaces, like these edges need to meet as well. Excuse me. All right. So I can always join these back together by moving and snapping the edges together, right? And going through and, for the join to, you have to click these sequentially, enter, right? And they'll kind of flash it a little bit. And then you'll see, okay, yeah, that got joined together. So that's explode and join. So those two are grouped together. The other kind of counterpart to this, which doesn't try to join geometry, is group and ungroup. Now, join and explode, right, are kind of pairs because join requires, right, the geometry actually to have this sort of touching relationship with each other, right? They have to be aligned. Group and ungroup don't. Group and ungroup actually are a kind of organizational tool that you can use in conjunction with layers, because sometimes like you need to put things that are on different layers, but you want them to be together, right? A good example might be, let's say, I have this volume here, right? And I have these two linears, and maybe there's two more. And let's actually just copy these. And I'm using copy vertical to do this. I'm going to line my lower edge with this lower edge like that. Okay. So let's say I just wanted to always keep, right, this orange box and then these four linears that bracket its edges together, right? So I would just group them. The shortcut key is actually ctrl+G, right? You can type group if you want, but ctrl+G basically does it, right? And what that does is that even though that they're actually kind of disassociate geometry, they're on different layers even, right? But when I click on them, right, and I move them, now they start to move. Oops, that did a bad move. Now they start to move together regardless, right? So that's a group. Obviously, the reverse is ungroup. And when you ungroup it, then, okay, now these are independent things again. Okay, so this is actually just a more of a kind of organizational thing, right? Sometimes you just want things to be put together or organized together without actually being on the same layer or without them actually being joined, right? So in that case, like these kind of disparate, right, curves, even though they are touching or they're intersecting, but they're not touching ends, so I can't join them, right? But I can group them. So when I group them, then now they move together, they're edited together, they scale together, right? You can do a lot of operations on them as a group together, okay? Ungroup, so group, ctrl+G, or you can type group. Ungroup, you can type ungroup, or ctrl+shift+G is ungroup. Okay, so those are just like the sort of hotkeys. And these are all written in the sort of command list that is distributed to you all. Okay. Okay, a couple other quick things that are helpful to know. Let me actually explode this, right? Okay, so we know trim, right, from last time, so tr trim, select cutting object. So this is the cutting object, and we can trim like things off, right? Curves off like this, right? Trim actually works on multiple objects at the same time. So I can select all these and execute the trim command. And I can do a multi-trim, meaning that I can click here, I can click here, I can click there, I can click there, I can click there, right? And I just made a Big Dipper. And this is, right, it operates simultaneously on multiple lines. You just have to click the right side, right, for it to trim. Okay. Now, its reverse is extend. So extend means that I can pick a boundary surface or boundary object, meaning this, for example, enter, and then I can click on curves that I want to extend it to. So if I click on this curve, it will automatically extend over there. If I click this one, it just finds the possible, right, intersection and extends it that way. This one, it does it that way. This one probably doesn't have an intersection, right? So when we click on it like that, it will just kind of do this and say, oh, where do you want me to go? Same thing for this one, right? But you can still do things like this to get parallel lines, for example, right? Just so you understand, and this actually works within it sometimes, not all the time, because that kind of inverts the relationship, okay? Now, there's another situation. So trim, extend, right, opposites. There's another situation, let's say, for example, I'll set this up a certain way, called connect. That's actually really helpful too. So I'm going to extend this really quick. there's an option to enter for dynamic extend. That's what I'm doing here right now. And I'm just actually clicking on this so I can do this. Okay. So let's say, right, to get this sort of corner, right, I want to trim those two. So typically you would do a trim command, select cutting objects, enter, right, and then click on here to get this corner, right? Okay. Now, again, this next command is a shortcut for that. Basically, what it does, what it's called is connect. So connect, essentially, it asks you for your first curve to connect, this one, the second curve to connect, that one, and it actually just does that automatically for you, right? It not only does that, but let's say if I'm looking at this relationship, so this curve to this curve, okay? So again, connect, first curve there, first, second curve there, right? It actually deletes the rest, right? So you have to click on the right side for things. So if I undo that and rerun the command, first curve on this end of the curve, and then second curve, right, on this end of the curve, then it deletes that side and connects it to this side. Okay, so basically on the curve, on the midpoint, right, when you're doing these commands, right, it depends, or it matters which side, which end of the curve you're clicking on, because that would determine which direction it goes, just so that you're aware. Extend actually also works with planes. So let's see. I'll rotate this 90 degrees, right? So it's sort of, you know, in place over here. And actually, I'm going to show this as a way to do this. Like, so I can try to make this bigger, right? I could have probably moved the edge and try to make it wider. On the gumball, right, there are going to be these little squares at the extents. This is a sort of intuitive scaling tool. So if I click on it and drag, you'll see I just automatically make this plane wider, right, in those two directions. Okay, I'm just making it bigger so I know that for sure, right, this is covering, right, it will intersect with these lines. Okay, so extend. All right, boundary objects, the plane, enter, it's curve to extend, basically these things, right? Now, like I said before, this actually is sometimes, right, is actually dependent on the angle, right? So these extension things, I typically would try to do it from a top view and click here, click here. This one, is it actually? Yeah, it's meeting, right? So it should, what it should do is should extend to that plane, right? And do that, okay? Another sometimes handy things, if you're just checking to see if things are crossing or intersecting, is intersecting is actually the intersect command. The intersect command will actually give you points where things intersect. So let's say I select all of these and typed intersect. And what it does, it makes little points at places where these geometries touch. So I know wherever there's a point, it's actually making an intersection, right? So it's actually touching that plane. It's actually making an intersection there, right? It's just like sometimes you actually nudge things and like this plane is like slightly above and you don't really see it in the top view unless you get really, really close, right? That happens, okay? So that's a tool for this and for kind of checking a bunch of things. Okay. All right. An extension of that scaling thing that we did with the gumball, this actually, let me copy one of these guys out as well. This actually works with 3D geometry like this too, right? So the box, for example, anything like this along these lines, you will see like sometimes you have to zoom in, right? But let's say in this case, right? This guy, this red little square, the blue little square, right? These are the scaling grips. So the scaling grip here, like if I click on it and drag, then it basically scales in both directions, right? The height. If I click on the red thing and drag, right, it basically scales the width, right? A little bit more intuitively, right? Now I have to zoom out to be able to see the green one, right, which is in this direction, right, at the end. So I can make it shorter, right? So now it's more like a rectangle. So this is more intuitive. As is the case with all gumball things, you can click on it and type a scaling factor. So I can say 0.5, so it'd be half as wide. I can click here and say 0.5, it'll be half as tall. Okay, so works this way as well. Now another kind of maybe slightly different but useful command is scale. We did scale, normal scale last time, but scale 1D is helpful because I can click on an object, enter, right? And I click a base point, click a reference point and say, okay, I want to go that far or this close or whatever, right? And that's a kind of, just slightly different version of doing the MoveFace command, right? That I showed you guys earlier. Just, some people prefer this over the other, depends on the situation. Okay. Another kind of management thing here is lock or unlock. So we know that we can use the lock pad here in the layers manager, right, to lock certain layers, right? Sometimes if you just want to lock a object temporarily, let's say, I have a bunch of things here on my linear elements layer, and I don't want to lock my entire linear elements layer. I just want to lock these two. So I can choose them and just type lock. And when it's locked, when an object is locked, it's the same thing, right? It's not selectable. You can't select it and just turns gray, right? The nice thing about that is that you should, let me see, you can still snap to it, right? So I'm still able to snap to, the ends of that linear, right, to use it as reference geometry to start things, but I just can't accidentally select or drag it, okay? And then to unlock it, you just type unlock. So very simple, and the gray disappears, it's unlocked. All right, last thing here, command-wise, really, is, let me delete these guys here. None of this really is necessary. Okay, so this orange guy, remember I delete the ends of it, right? Okay, and this happens sometimes. For example, if I kind of had a surface here, I'm just going to make one really quick and move it down. Okay, and let's use this to trim it, and so trim that. Okay, so I'm left with this, right? I use that to trim it, and this is just kind of showing you that it's adapto, mean that okay, maybe if I did a trim that's diagonal, that still works, as long as the end is a planar surface, right? Let's say I want to fill it up, so cap. So I selected it first, type cap, enter. What it does, it tries to fill up any holes in it, right, as best it can. Usually it'll work if your slice is one single slice, meaning that it was a planar slice, right? If it's a non-planar slice, then it won't work, okay? A non-planar slice is more when there's a fold in the slice. So let's say, and I'm just gonna try to create this situation for you guys. So, and actually I might want to exaggerate that. Okay, this is a non-planar slice, right? Because the two edges of the slice are misaligned, right? And so if you try to cap that, then it'll cap one side, but this side, right, which is not a planar slice anymore, right? It's two slices. So if I actually drew a plane and let's say use triangles here, right? What you will see that is basically, it's not a single plane, it's a folded plane, right? In these cases, cap won't work. Cap can only fill, right, sort of planar slices. Okay. Those are just their commands that are, kind of semi-helpful just to kind of get you guys, give you guys the ability to refine certain geometries. All right. Now I'm going to move on to a couple other things that are more related to output, right? Outputting things. So first thing, so we talked about different kinds of views last time, right? And now let's say, you've always been taking the same view every time, right? What I'm going to show you is how to save views, right? It's sort of like saving camera locations, okay? So what happens here is let's say, for example, and we've done this before, set view, right? Let's go to isometric and let's say southeast. Yeah, okay, southeast is good. I just select this, zoom, select onto it and say, okay, this is my view. I want to save it, right? For whatever reason, there actually are a bunch of reasons eventually for compositing that you would want to save this view and be able to return to it very precisely, okay? But for now, so right click, okay? So set view, and here's an option called the named views, right? When I click on it, it will bring up a little floating dock thing, okay? And in this panel, there is a save as, right? And we're called, so this is a parallel. You can rename this whatever you want, save name port as. So let's call it SE Exxon, okay? Say okay. Now that gets saved, okay? Now my other view, let's say is a isometric, let's do northwest, for example. So this is the backside. Same thing, right? So I can save another one and NW, right, axon, oops, NW axon. So it saves it there, right? That means I can toggle in between these just by double clicking on them, right? And so that view is always going to be saved. I can move around, right, whatever, do things. But when I click on it, it just brings me back, all right? Now you can decide if you want to, you can dock it here, right? I usually don't, but you can dock it into here, one of these these panels here. If you right click, and this is more interface stuff, if you right click on any of these tabs here, you can actually bring these things, a lot of these things up. So the layers is here, help is here. I usually turn help off. And then name views right here, right? Right, so that disappears. But if you want to bring it back, right, just do name views. If you want to pull it out, just pull it out, right? Depends on what you're more comfortable with. Okay, so that's that. Now, let's say for saving perspective views, right? I want to switch back to set view perspective. Okay, and let's say I'm trying to get an interior shot, like a more internal shot of my spaces, right? And actually for this exercise, I'm actually going to go to my layers and turn off the diagrams layer so I have a bit more room or space, okay? And so I'm trying to zoom in, right? And what you'll find is that like the default, let's say field of view, right, angle is a little narrow, right? Because it's kind of used for looking from outside. Once I get kind of into a space, right, you'll see that the sort of field of view is very limited, right? So what you can do is, as long as you're not selecting anything, right? And if you go to this, right, the properties panel here, what you will say is it will tell you what projection you're in. So you can actually change the projection here if you wanted to, instead of going over there and right clicking, right? It has a camera thing here, right? Lens length, blah, 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 all these sorts of things, right? So lens length is set to 50 by default, okay? So this basically kind of correlates to like actual, let's say DSLR optic camera lenses, right? So let's say 24, right? And you see like the sort of field of view got bigger. 24, right? 18, 22, these are kind of wide angle lenses, right? So it's sort of like, maybe some of your cameras have a wide angle now, right? The same view, I haven't touched my view. Let's say if it didn't touch my view, now I can see more, right? I can see more of my project now, okay? So if you just change this, right? 18, let's say, even wider, right? So I see more ground, I see more up there. There's going to be a limit where you want to go, right? Let's say 18 is kind of, the extreme of a, normal, right? Wide angle lens. 12, maybe, right? Anything further than that gets really, really kind of exaggerated and a little bit unrealistic, right? Because your vanishing lines get really exaggerated, okay? Now, by the same token, right? Let's say 50 is the normal, that's zoomed in, right? So 75, 80, whatever, these are kind of like telephoto lenses, basically 135, right? Meaning that I'm zooming in further, and the more parallel it will look, right? So I can zoom out further with this view, and you'll see that it actually starts to, right? It starts to look more and more like the axonometric or parallel projection, the bigger this number is, okay? That's if you're just like not selecting anything, okay? So now I'm going to go back to, let's say 22, okay? And you'll see it's just exaggerated again, and I'm going to kind of zoom in and just kind of try to get in here, right, into my spaces and say, okay, I like that view. I'm okay with this, right? And again, go to my name views, right? Save a new one and say, let's say interior 01, and say okay. Again, right? So that's how I can swap really quickly between things. If I change things to test it and I know I like this view, I want to see what kind of change it made to this particular view. That's how you change it. All right. So there's that. And these, right, hold true even between the different view styles, for example, right? So in ArcticView, this is what you get, et cetera, et cetera. These are all kind of things that live in this sort of space. Okay, so that's saving views. Okay, now let's go a bit into the display options. Oops, wrong. Display options. So you may remember last time, like me telling you that, oh yeah, you can dig with these display options, you can customize them, and whatever you change like turns purple, right? So you can kind of change all these things. You can change the color of the edges. If you kind of find the right show these things, is the single color, is using the object color, right? So just kind of play with some of these settings, find something you like, whether it has transparency or not. All these things are kind of things you can play with. There's a lot. I'm not going to go through them all one by one, right? Each of these also have like sub objects in them, objects, shadows, other settings, right, that you can mess around with, just kind of see what it does, okay? But what I want to talk about today actually is not just these settings, but how can you make your own, okay? So as an example, one of my, let's say, and let me change to a different view here. One of the settings I like a lot, right? Let's say the sort of normal pen. So this is pen restore defaults. Okay. So I'll change this to pen. So this is the basic default pen setting, right? Now the default pen setting is kind of nice as almost like a faux drawing, right? Line drawing, kind of thing. You can actually tweak it so it looks even more sketchy, right? You can do like a sketchy effect if you want to, like an artistic sketchy effect, if that's what you want to do. But one of the things I don't like about the default pen style is its background, okay? Now, of course, like I showed you before, the pen style here, right, I can go to background image file, right, change it to a solid color, and it just becomes white, and that's fine, right? But let's say like you just have several settings, right, that you are switching in between, and you don't want to have to tweak them every single time. And so there is a way under display modes to actually make your own custom display modes, meaning that I can pick one that I want to start out with, right? So in this case, you'll see I already have a copy, but I can, let's say, highlight the pen view style, right, or display mode, right, make a copy. So you call copy of pen, whatever. So let's just say pen, rename it, right, pen, let's say version 2, okay? And this one, I don't know, whatever. Let's do gray for the background as a solid color. And, let's say change this single color for all objects. And just for the heck of it, make it red, whatever. Okay, and so right click and switch to your pen v2, right? So you see I have a new one here, and it just applies those settings. Okay, so now under the entry for pen v2, right? Now I can change things and know that, okay, it's not modifying the default one, it's not, right? But I can always save it as a separate one, so I can switch between several of them if I wanted to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, show hidden lines or not, show seams, show curves. If I don't want to hide the curves and only want to see things that are actual geometry, do I want to shade the objects, right? So that's where that red comes in. So maybe I'll change this to gray, maybe too dark, light gray. Okay, right? Does it have shadows or not? If I turn on the shadows, oops. So now, right, now this has shadows, quality of shadows, speed, etc. These are all kind of things you can mess around with. Okay, but that just means that you have the capability to make your own custom view style. So play around with things, but once you, right, it might be a sort of situation where once you get to a place where, oh, I actually really like these view settings, copy it out, save it as a custom one, and so it'll always be there when you need it, right? Then you don't have to kind of redo those settings every single time you're trying to view export. Okay, all that stuff is there. One last thing for me to mention that is a sort of, quality of life improvement is all these commands that we talked about, right? Of course, we can kind of type in the full version, right? And like you said, some of them have shortcut keys like Control-C, Control-V, Control-G, group, etc. But if it doesn't, you can make your own, meaning that, so for example, I think TR by default is something else, triangulation, triangulate mesh, right? I have mine set so my TR goes to trim, right? So you'll see when I type TR spacebar, it goes to trim. And the way you do something like that is actually just set up your own keyboard shortcuts. So go to Options, right? And let me do that. OK, so under Options, there is an entry called Aliases. And under Aliases, here are all the keyboard shortcuts. Now, you'll have a slightly different list than mine. Some of them will be similar. Some of them will be different. For example, I have my E set to extrude, right? I have EX set to extend, IN set to intersect, right? Or INT. I have M to move. I have ME to move edge, MF to move face, MI to mirror, right? So these are just some things that I often find myself using commonly, right? And so if you find yourself using certain commands over and over and over again, and you're just like, either too lazy, you don't want to be typing in the same long ass command all the time, then aliases is where you do it, right? So you can just say, so like rotate 3D, these are not common ones, right? My R is just rotate, so R spacebar basically gives me the rotate command, right? So these are great. S1, scale 1D, S2, scale 2D, right? TR, right? Now you don't have to follow these. You can just kind of figure out what works for you, right? Everyone has sort of different ones, okay? So a good example for me is my line, my L actually just goes to polyline. I don't bother with a normal line at all, right? So I just make one for polyline. Now, to make a new one, let's say just click here, right, new, and you'll just get a new, kind of entry. So let's say, I don't know, let's do SS, right, and make this sphere, and just say, OK, so SS, enter, and actually just gives me the sphere command, right? Very simple, straightforward, OK? So that's kind of just remembering commands. And now that I saw the sphere, I just remember there's one more thing I want to show you guys. It's a sort of family of commands that are kind of maybe useful further down the line, but it's called Booleans. So I'm going to copy this out and actually change back to my shaded mode. I usually use shaded mode for modeling, and actually change this back to perspective. I like modeling in perspective. That's just me though. Okay, so this family is called the Boolean commands, and if you just type Boolean, right, you'll see a whole series of them pop up. And they actually kind of do what you think they do mathematically, okay? So to get that point across, I'm going to make another little thing here, right? And maybe a kind of smaller one there, and maybe a sphere actually, right? SS like we did before. Okay. So let me drag this, make it slightly longer. Okay. So what Boolean actually allows you to do is, like, particularly if I'm going to shove one into the other like this, it doesn't really matter, is that actually allows me to subtract using another geometry or another volume. Let me make this slightly bigger too, like that. Okay. So, and some of these you might see this better in X-ray mode, right? Just to see the intersections. So Boolean, the one that pops up here is BooleanDifference, right? So BooleanDifference, select surfaces or polysurface to subtract from. So we're subtracting from the orange one. I just realized that we have Gator colors, orange and blue here. Enter to continue. Select surface or polysurface to subtract with. So I'm subtracting with this blue thing that I popped in there, right? And delete input is set to yes, meaning that once the command is run, it will delete the inputs. So in this case, the blue thing will disappear. So, and what happened is that it used that blue thing as a thing to carve it out, right? To subtract from it. Okay, so that's what the Boolean commands do. And by the same token, right? Let me play with this a little bit so it looks a little bit better. By the same token, you can BooleanUnion. So Boolean, split, intersection, right? Those are all different ones. Intersection finds their intersection. So BooleanUnion will join them, right? So select surfaces or polysurface to union. So this one, right? Enter. So you'll see that it's been merged into one blue thing now. Let me switch that back to its proper volume layer, right? So now this orange thing, right, is a combination of the two. Now, what's really cool is that, of course, it can do complex things like, let's say if I shove this sphere into it, right? That's a really kind of weirder shape or surface, right? So BooleanDifference, again, subtracting from the orange using the blue, and you'll see that it's able to do that as well, right? So it's a complex intersection, right? But because the Boolean commands work this way, you can actually use it that way too. You can use the Booleans with solids or surfaces as well, right? So it works on these guys, right? It will just kind of chew it or cut it out, right? If I stuck that sphere in there or a cylinder in here, that's what would happen. Okay. If you want to, I can demo the, let's say, the intersection. So let's do something like this. Move it that way a little bit. Okay. So Boolean intersection, right? First set. So the cylinder is the first set. Second set is this. So it leaves us with whatever the intersection of the cylinder and the orange thing was. Okay. So cool, right? That's kind of how you work more, let's say, stereotomically, right? With the Boolean commands. Most of these, right, the way we're modeling here is more tectonic, meaning these are all kind of separate individual things, right? This is kind of a way of modeling more stereotomically, more like if you're kind of carving into it. It's not true stereotom because if I zoom into it, or if you X-ray, you can cut it open. I can actually still explode these guys, right? So if I explode it, then you'll see these are all still individual surfaces, right? They're all just kind of assembled and joined together, right? So they look like a solid, right? So they're just joined together to look solid. Now, even if it was exploded, right, I can still join it back, J, and it's one closed polysurface, right? You can look at the feedback on your command line to see if the command actually worked or not. Okay, there's that. I think there was one more thing here on the list is that there's a thing in terms of drawing things vertically. I know this mode is a bit more difficult to draw vertically because when I draw lines, they kind of default to being on the XY plane, right? unless you're snapping to things in space. Let's say if I'm snapping to that thing and I'm actually using my, smart track guides, then I can guarantee that I'm drawing on this higher plane. But then you'll see that, okay, as soon as I snap to something else, then it starts going off in space over there, right? So drawing vertical things in the 3D view sometimes can be tricky, but there is a mode called elevator mode. So start a polyline, let's say here, right? And I want to draw this line vertically. You could switch, right, to a different view, zoom out, right, and say, okay, I'm going to draw it here vertically in this right view, right, which kind of constrains it. If you're too lazy to do that, right, hold down the control key, right, and just click in the same place once, let go, and then now you're in elevator mode, right? In elevator mode, what that means is that the clicks are constrained to that vertical, anywhere in that vertical line, okay? So that's a sort of a, shortcut sometimes that people like to do or like to know about. Okay, let me see if there's anything else. I think that's mostly it. Yeah, the rest of it, just kind of getting used to it, turning on your object snaps over here on the left when required or when necessary. And, good luck and have fun rhinoing.